She slid a $750 check across the counter and called it my fair share. After my grandfather left me his entire $62 million estate, my mother told everyone I manipulated him, and my sister tried to blackmail me for property. They thought I'd disappear quietly. Instead, I brought receipts and watched their perfect little image burn in court. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am 34 years old, and until last week, I believed that no matter how complicated my family could be, blood still meant something when it came down to it, especially after a funeral. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, built everything from nothing, turning a handful of rundown duplexes in Port Briar, Oregon into a real estate empire that people estimated to be worth somewhere around $62 million. And for as long as I can remember, he carried himself like a man who valued grit, loyalty, and fairness above all else. I did not grow up spoiled despite the wealth surrounding our last name, because my grandfather always said money was a tool, not a cushion, and if you leaned on it too much, it would collapse under you. I built my own tech company from scratch, never asking him for capital, even though he offered more than once, because I wanted to stand on my own feet and prove that the Caldwell Drive ran in my veins without needing a safety net. A week after we buried him, after the condolences had dried up and the catered food trays were long gone, my parents called and asked me to come over to their house in Willow Creek Heights. Their tone on the phone was flat and businesslike, and something in my chest tightened the moment my mother said they needed to discuss the estate. I drove there in silence, watching the familiar tree-lined streets pass by, remembering childhood holidays in that house where everything looked polished and perfect from the outside, even when it never truly felt warm inside. While I walked in that afternoon, there were no hugs, no soft words about missing Grandpa, no shared grief to bond over. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and the marble kitchen island gleamed under the recessed lighting as if it had been staged for a photo shoot rather than a family conversation about loss. My father, Thomas Caldwell, stood stiffly near the sink with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable and distant, while my younger sister Brittany leaned casually against a bar stool, scrolling through her phone with an air of boredom that felt almost rehearsed. My mother, Linda Caldwell, did not waste time with small talk. She reached into a leather folder, pulled out a single check, and slid it across the marble counter toward me without meeting my eyes. The paper made a soft, scraping sound against the stone that seemed louder than it should have been in the otherwise silent kitchen. I glanced down and saw the number written in neat blue ink. $750. For a moment, I genuinely thought it had to be some kind of administrative reimbursement, maybe travel expenses for flying in relatives, or covering funeral costs. My mind tried to rationalize it because the alternative felt absurd. My mother finally spoke in a tone so calm it bordered on clinical and said that this was my fair portion of Walter's estate. She explained that the assets had been structured in a way that primarily benefited the immediate household, and that I should understand how these things work. My father nodded once as if to seal the statement, as though this were a standard business transaction and not the distribution of a $62 million legacy. I felt something hollow open up inside me. Not explosive anger, not even immediate outrage, just a strange numb disbelief that made everything around me seem slightly unreal. I looked at Brittany, and she gave me a small smirk, the kind that barely lifts the corners of the mouth but carries a clear message of superiority, and she said I should be grateful because not everyone gets anything at all. The words hung in the air like a thin veil of mockery. In that moment, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a clerical oversight. They believed I would accept this quietly. They believed I would take the humiliation, deposit the check, and move on with my life as if my grandfather's legacy had nothing to do with me. I thought about the hours I spent with him as a teenager walking through construction sites while he explained zoning laws and negotiation tactics, about the way he would clap me on the shoulder and tell me that I had a sharp mind and that I would build something bigger than he ever did. I thought about how he attended the launch party for my startup and told everyone within earshot that his grandson did not need his money because he had his own vision. The idea that he intentionally left me $750 out of tens of millions did not align with the man I knew. The disconnect between my memories and the reality in front of me crystallized into something colder and steadier than anger. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of manipulation or theft, even though the word echoed in my mind. I simply looked at the check again, then at my parents, and realized that this was a calculated move designed to test whether I would challenge them or fold. They were counting on my independence, on my success, on the narrative that I did not need anything from the estate. They expected me to swallow the insult, because financially I could survive without it. What they underestimated was that this was not about the money. It was about respect, about truth, and about honoring a man who taught me never to let anyone rewrite reality for convenience. I left the check on the counter, where it lay like a cheap tip after an expensive meal. I picked up my keys, walked toward the door, and felt their eyes on my back as if they were already congratulating themselves for having handled the situation efficiently. Just before stepping out, I turned around and looked at all three of them standing there in their immaculate kitchen, framed by polished stone and stainless steel. I told them in a voice that surprised even me with its calmness that I would see them in court. Then I walked out without waiting for a response, the numb disbelief fully transforming into a cold, unwavering clarity that this was far from over. Standing in that driveway after telling my parents I would see them in court, I felt the weight of something much older than that single humiliating check. Because the truth is I had been the outsider in my own family long before money ever entered the equation. Growing up, the dynamic in our house was never openly hostile, but it was carefully imbalanced in ways that only become obvious when you look back with adult clarity. Brittany was the golden child from the beginning, the one whose achievements were celebrated regardless of their scale, whose moods dictated the atmosphere at dinner, whose smallest inconveniences were treated like crises that required immediate parental intervention. I, on the other hand, was labeled independent early on, which in our household was a polite synonym for emotionally distant and self-sufficient enough not to require investment. If Brittany brought home a decent grade, there would be a special dessert. If she tried a new hobby, my parents would rearrange schedules and budgets to accommodate it. When I started spending hours teaching myself to code at 14, hunched over a secondhand laptop in my room, my father would pass by the doorway and say I should spend less time staring at a screen and more time being social. Independence was expected of me, but encouragement was reserved for her. That divide only widened as we grew older. At 22, while most of my college peers were still figuring out internships, I built a software analytics startup out of a cramped apartment in Port Briar, surviving on cheap takeout and caffeine while writing code through the night. I bootstrapped the entire operation, negotiated early contracts myself, and slowly grew the client base until larger firms began to take notice. 2 years later, when the company sold for $3.8 million, I remember driving to Willow Creek Heights with a copy of the acquisition agreement sitting on the passenger seat, feeling a rare sense of anticipation that maybe, finally, I would see pride reflected in my parents' faces. Instead, my mother skimmed the numbers and commented that tech valuations were inflated bubbles waiting to burst, and my father asked what I planned to do next, as if I had just finished a temporary summer job. There was no celebratory dinner, no toast, no acknowledgement that their son had built and exited a company before turning 25. Meanwhile, Brittany pursued lifestyle blogging and influencer branding with an enthusiasm that seemed to fluctuate based on trends, and my parents funded every photo shoot, every brand consultant, every trip she claimed was necessary for content. They converted a spare room into a studio for her, installed custom lighting, and proudly shared her curated posts with friends as if she were a rising media mogul. When she gained a few thousand followers, they treated it like a corporate milestone. The contrast was never explicitly stated, but it was always there like a quiet scoreboard that I was never meant to win. Through all of it, my grandfather Walter was the only person who looked at me and saw potential rather than inconvenience. Every Sunday, without fail, I would drive to his office or meet him at one of his properties, and we would walk through buildings that smelled of fresh paint and sawdust while he explained cap rates, tenant risk profiles, and the subtle art of negotiating from a position of calm authority. He would hand me financial statements and ask me what I thought, not to test me, but to train me, treating my opinions as worthy of refinement rather than dismissal. Those weekly visits became an education more valuable than any formal degree because he taught me how to evaluate real estate not just by numbers, but by trajectory, by understanding neighborhoods 5 or 10 years before they transformed. He quietly mentored me in long-term investing, explaining why patience often outperformed aggression, why liquidity mattered, and why ego was the most expensive liability an investor could carry. Sometimes we would sit in his office overlooking downtown Port Briar, sunlight catching the edges of framed property maps on the wall, and he would talk about mistakes he made in his 30s, about partnerships that dissolved, about the importance of structuring assets intelligently so that emotions could not unravel decades of work. I absorbed every word, not because I expected an inheritance, but because I respected him and felt respected in return. My parents often mocked those visits, especially as they became more frequent. I remember my mother once saying at dinner that I was wasting my time shadowing an old man who should have retired years ago, and my father added that real estate was outdated compared to modern ventures, implying that my grandfather's success belonged to a different era. They framed my Sundays with Walter as avoidance, as though I were clinging to the past instead of building a future. What they did not understand was that those hours were the only times I felt fully seen within my own family. On more than one occasion, after hearing about some dismissive comment from my parents, Walter would lean back in his chair, fold his hands over his stomach, and give me a small, knowing smile. He would say, "They underestimate you. Let them," in a tone that carried both amusement and warning. He never encouraged confrontation, never suggested proving anyone wrong out of spite. Instead, he taught me to build quietly, to let results speak without fanfare, to recognize that being underestimated can be a strategic advantage if you are disciplined enough to use it. Those words echoed in my mind now as clearly as if he were standing beside me in that driveway. They underestimate you, let them. Growing up as the outsider had hardened me in ways that I did not fully appreciate until this moment. I had learned to operate without validation, to create without applause, to succeed without expecting celebration. And as I sat in my car with the engine idling, thinking about the $750 check waiting on that marble counter, I realized that the same family dynamic that shaped my childhood had simply evolved into something larger, more calculated, and far more consequential. The formal reading of the will took place in a glass conference room high above downtown Port Briar inside the financial tower, the kind of building my grandfather appreciated because it symbolized permanence and leverage rather than vanity. And as I stepped out of the elevator and walked across the polished stone floor toward the reception desk, I felt an unsettling mix of anticipation and restraint settling over me like a tailored jacket that fit too tightly across the shoulders. The estate lawyer, Gregory Hastings, was already waiting when I entered the conference room, his silver hair combed back with meticulous precision, his posture straight, his expression carefully neutral in the way that only attorneys accustomed to high net worth disputes seem to master. My parents sat side by side, along one side of the long mahogany table, my mother's handbag placed perfectly upright near her elbow, my father's hands folded calmly in front of him, while Brittany sat slightly apart, scrolling through her phone until she noticed me and offered a thin smile that carried more calculation than warmth. The blinds were partially drawn, letting in filtered light that reflected off the city skyline and cast pale, geometric patterns across the table's glossy surface. And as I took my seat opposite them, I could feel the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing silently against my ribs. Gregory cleared his throat and began by outlining the structure of the estate in measured, precise language, listing commercial buildings across multiple districts, equity stakes in development firms, diversified investment portfolios, and offshore accounts that collectively brought the estimated value to approximately $62 million. Hearing the numbers spoken aloud in that controlled, professional tone stripped it of abstraction and gave it substance, and I noticed Brittany sit up straighter, her attention suddenly fixed on the documents in front of her. As Gregory continued, He referenced specific properties I had walked through with my grandfather, buildings whose foundations I had once stood on while listening to him discuss zoning projections and tenant diversification, and each mention felt less like a surprise and more like a confirmation of how deliberate Walter had always been in structuring his empire. There was no theatrical pause when Gregory reached the section that detailed the beneficiaries, no dramatic clearing of the throat, just the steady rhythm of legal language unfolding exactly as written. He stated first that Linda Caldwell was to receive nothing from the estate. The word nothing seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, even though it had been delivered in the same, even cadence as every other sentence. My mother did not flinch. She did not gasp or object. She simply maintained her composed posture, her face smooth and unreadable. Gregory then stated that Thomas Caldwell was to receive nothing from the estate. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but otherwise he remained still, his eyes focused on a fixed point on the table, as though he had anticipated the wording long before this reading. Brittany shifted in her seat when her name followed, and when Gregory declared that Brittany Caldwell was to receive nothing from the estate, the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was dense, almost physical, pressing against the walls of the room and filling the space between each of us. For a split second, I wondered whether I had misheard, whether there was some clause or trust structure yet to be clarified, but Gregory did not hesitate. He continued, stating that Ethan Caldwell was to inherit the entirety of the estate, all commercial holdings, all equity stakes, all liquid and offshore accounts, along with full authority and responsibility over their management and disposition. The words did not rush or swell. They were delivered with the same steady professionalism, yet they seemed to reverberate in my ears. He then read a moral clause included by my grandfather, a paragraph written in language less sterile than the rest of the document, specifying that the inheritance was granted not merely as a transfer of wealth, but as a charge of integrity and stewardship, emphasizing that the assets were to be maintained and grown with discipline, transparency, and respect for the communities they affected. Hearing those words, I felt the familiar cadence of Walter's voice embedded within them, as though he had found a way to speak directly through the document itself. For several long seconds after Gregory finished, no one spoke. The air conditioning hummed softly above us, and somewhere outside the window, a distant siren wailed and faded. Brittany was the first to break the silence, her composure cracking as she leaned forward and accused Gregory of making an error, her voice rising just enough to betray the disbelief she could no longer contain. She insisted that there had to be a mistake in the paperwork, that perhaps an earlier draft had been read instead of the final version, that this distribution made no sense. Gregory responded calmly, assuring her that the document had been verified multiple times and was legally binding in its current form. What struck me most was not Brittany's reaction, but my parents' restraint. They did not explode with outrage or demand immediate explanations. They did not challenge Gregory's competence or question the authenticity of the will. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance that carried an unspoken understanding, a quiet calculation that unsettled me more than any visible anger would have. Their calmness did not feel like acceptance. It felt strategic, as though this reading was merely the first move in a process they had already prepared to contest. My mother finally spoke in a controlled tone, stating that they would, of course, need to review the document with their own counsel, her choice of words deliberate and measured. I sat there absorbing the magnitude of what had just been declared, aware that the humiliation of the $750 check now stood exposed as something far more audacious. The same family who had slid that token amount across a marble counter as my supposed portion had just been formally excluded from the estate entirely, while I had been named sole heir with an explicit mandate about integrity and stewardship. The silence in that conference room felt different now, no longer hollow but charged, as though the ground beneath us had shifted in a way that none of us could ignore. The lawsuit was filed less than 3 weeks after the will reading, And I learned about it not through a phone call from my parents, but through a formal notification delivered to my attorney's office outlining allegations so carefully worded that they felt rehearsed long before my grandfather's funeral, accusations of undue influence, diminished capacity, and coercion woven together into a narrative designed to cast me not as a grandson who had been mentored for years, but as a calculating opportunist who preyed on an aging man in his final days. Reading the document for the first time, I felt that same cold clarity I had experienced in my parents' kitchen, because the claims were not impulsive or emotional, they were structured, deliberate, and strategically timed to destabilize both the estate and my reputation at once. Within days, the rumors began to spread beyond the courtroom filings and into the social sphere, first in whispers passed between extended relatives, then in subtle posts on social media that avoided naming me directly but made it clear who the target was, references to betrayal, to manipulation, to vulnerable elders taken advantage of by ambitious heirs. It did not take long for acquaintances I had not spoken to in years to message me with thinly veiled accusations, some framing their words as concern, others dispensing with politeness altogether and labeling me greedy, implying that no grandson could possibly inherit $62 million without having pulled strings behind the scenes. The speed at which the narrative shifted stunned me less than the ease with which people accepted it, as though wealth automatically implied wrongdoing and family conflict required a villain. The professional fallout followed quickly. I had been in the final stages of negotiating a co-investment deal in Denver involving a mixed-use development project that would have marked my first major expansion since the sale of my startup. And weeks of due diligence had already been completed when the managing partner abruptly requested a meeting to discuss newly surfaced concerns. Sitting across from him in a quiet conference room, I watched as he slid printed screenshots across the table. Financial documents allegedly tied to the estate that appeared to show irregular transfers and questionable account activity. I recognized immediately that they were falsified, the formatting inconsistent, the transaction codes incorrect, yet their existence alone was enough to introduce doubt. My parents had circulated those manipulated images through discreet channels, leveraging long-standing business relationships to seed suspicion without ever making a direct public accusation. The Denver deal collapsed within 48 hours, the partners citing reputational risk rather than contractual issues, and just like that, months of planning dissolved because someone had successfully reframed me as a liability. During this escalation, Brittany reached out privately, her call arriving late one evening with a tone so composed it bordered on casual, as though we were discussing logistics for a family holiday rather than an active legal battle that threatened to dismantle everything our grandfather had built. She spoke about how exhausting litigation could be, about how public disputes tarnish legacies, about how none of this needed to become uglier than it already was. Then she presented what she described as a peace deal, explaining that if I transferred 2 specific commercial properties into her name, assets that collectively represented only a fraction of the estate, but significant long-term value, they would drop the legal action entirely and allow the matter to conclude quietly. She added, almost as an afterthought, that I would be welcome at her upcoming wedding, that the family could heal if I showed goodwill now. Listening to her, I felt a detached sense of recognition rather than shock, because the proposal revealed exactly how they perceived the situation, not as a question of honoring my grandfather's wishes, but as a negotiation over leverage. The invitation to her wedding was framed like a restored privilege, as though my inclusion depended on compliance. I declined without raising my voice, stating simply that I would not transfer any properties and that the estate would be handled according to the will as written. There was a brief silence on the line before she responded that I was making a mistake, her tone cooling in a way that suggested the offer had never been about reconciliation, but about testing my resolve. Shortly after that conversation, an asset freeze was filed as part of the ongoing litigation, and portions of the estate were temporarily locked pending judicial review, restricting certain transactions and delaying strategic decisions that required liquidity. The practical implications were immediate. Operational flexibility narrowed, investment timelines disrupted, and even though I retained legal ownership under the will, access to segments of the portfolio became subject to oversight and delay. The freeze was not total, but it was sufficient to apply pressure, to slow momentum, to create the impression of instability that could ripple outward into other ventures. What struck me most throughout those weeks was not the aggression itself, but the coordination, the way legal filings, social insinuations, falsified financial materials, and private negotiations unfolded in overlapping waves designed to erode confidence from multiple directions. The smear campaign was not loud in a reckless way. It was quiet and methodical, engineered to plant doubt rather than scream accusations. Each message from an old acquaintance, each withdrawn handshake for a potential partner, each legal notice served as a reminder that this conflict was no longer confined to family dynamics, but had evolved into a calculated attempt to isolate me professionally and socially until conceding seemed easier than resisting. Yet beneath the strain and the temporary restrictions imposed by the asset freeze, the same lesson my grandfather had repeated for years settled in a place within me, not as defiance, but as discipline, a steady refusal to be cornered into surrendering something that had been entrusted to me with deliberate intention. Launching the Walter Caldwell Urban Scholarship Fund was not a strategic move designed to counter the lawsuit or repair my public image. It was something I had planned quietly in the weeks after the reading because I understood that stewardship meant action, and I committed $1.2 million as an initial endowment to create opportunities for students in underfunded urban districts across Port Briar. Students who reminded me of the interns I once mentored in my startup days, sharp, ambitious, and often overlooked. I chose to host the inaugural fundraising gala at Caldwell Exchange Hall, a renovated historic property that had once been one of my grandfather's earliest acquisitions, a building he saved from demolition decades ago and transformed into a commercial hub, and restoring it for the event felt symbolic, not performative but rooted in continuity. The night of the gala, the hall glowed under warm amber lighting that highlighted exposed brick walls and polished steel beams, the air carrying a blend of catered cuisine and subtle floral arrangements placed along high top tables where investors, educators, city officials, and local entrepreneurs mingled in formal attire. I wore a tailored dark suit that felt understated compared to the atmosphere, and as I moved through the room greeting guests, I felt a quiet sense of alignment between intention and action, as though this was the kind of initiative my grandfather would have approved of without unnecessary fanfare. A small stage had been set up near the far end of the hall, with a podium bearing the foundation's name, and behind it a projection screen displayed architectural photos of buildings Walter had revitalized over the years. My parents arrived noticeably later than most guests, entering the hall with a level of presentation that bordered on theatrical, my mother in an elaborate evening gown more suited to a red carpet than a philanthropic event, my father in a tuxedo that drew subtle glances from attendees dressed in more restrained formal wear, and Brittany trailing slightly behind them in a designer dress that shimmered under the lights. Their entrance shifted the energy in the room, not because of affection, but because tension has a way of altering atmospheres, even when unspoken. Conversations quieted momentarily as people recognized the family at the center of recent headlines, and I saw more than one guest glance between us, aware of the legal dispute that had already begun circulating through business circles and local media. When it came time for remarks, I stepped onto the stage and began outlining the mission of the Scholarship Fund, speaking about access to education, about long-term investment in human capital, about creating sustainable pathways rather than one-time gestures. My voice remained steady as I referenced my grandfather's belief that real legacy is measured not only in assets, but in impact, and for a brief stretch of minutes the room felt unified around that purpose. Then, without warning, Brittany rose from her table and approached the stage with a composure that suggested premeditation rather than spontaneity. Before I could react, she reached for the microphone as if participating in a coordinated program segment, her expression poised but charged. She began by congratulating the foundation in a tone that sounded almost sincere before pivoting toward what she described as family unity, implying that true legacy required collective agreement and mutual respect rather than unilateral control. Her words were carefully chosen, never directly accusing me of wrongdoing, yet clearly insinuating that my stewardship came at the expense of harmony, that generosity towards strangers did not compensate for division at home. The room grew still, guests shifting uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something far more personal than a philanthropic announcement. I stepped slightly back from the podium, allowing her to finish, recognizing that attempting to interrupt would only amplify the spectacle. Before the discomfort could dissipate, my mother stood abruptly from her seat and approached the front, her movements less composed than Brittany's but equally intentional. Her voice trembled as she spoke about my grandfather's final months, suggesting that he had been confused, that age had clouded his judgment, that decisions made near the end of life cannot always be trusted. She framed her words as concern rather than accusation, describing sleepless nights and emotional strain, and within moments what had begun as a gala transformed into a public airing of private allegations. I could see several attendees discreetly lowering their gazes, while others pulled out phones, not necessarily to record, but to message colleagues about the unfolding scene. By the following morning, local media outlets had seized on the event, headlines framing it as a millionaire family feud rather than a philanthropic launch, photos capturing my mother mid-gesture and Brittany at the microphone, the scholarship fund relegated to a secondary detail beneath the drama. Articles referenced the ongoing lawsuit and replayed excerpts of their remarks, speculating about motives and legitimacy, and once again the narrative shifted away from impact toward conflict. Reading those headlines, I felt neither shock nor anger, only a steady awareness that the battlefield had expanded into any space where visibility existed. What remained within my control was my response. At the end of the evening, after Brittany handed the microphone back and my mother returned to her seat dabbing at carefully managed tears, I stepped forward once more and addressed the room in the same measured tone I had used earlier. I did not counter their claims with legal arguments or personal accusations. I simply stated that my grandfather knew exactly who he was trusting, and that the scholarship fund was an extension of that trust, not a betrayal of anyone, but a fulfillment of responsibility. The words were not delivered with heat or defensiveness. They were grounded in certainty, and as I looked across the audience, I saw not unanimous approval, but something steadier, a recognition that composure in the face of provocation often speaks louder than spectacle. The discovery happened on a gray afternoon while I was alone in my grandfather's private study, a room that had remained largely untouched since his passing because the ongoing litigation had slowed any formal cataloging of personal effects, and I had finally decided to sort through his documents myself, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to feel anchored to something steady amid the escalating noise outside. The study smelled faintly of leather and old paper, sunlight filtering through tall windows and catching dust motes that drifted lazily above the heavy oak desk where he had signed countless contracts over the decades. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with binders, property ledgers, and framed photographs of buildings at various stages of construction, each one representing years of calculated risk and disciplined growth. I began opening drawers methodically, reviewing folders labeled in his precise handwriting, when I noticed a sealed envelope tucked beneath a stack of older tax files at the back of the lowest drawer. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and across the front, written in firm ink, was a single date from 1991. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from instinct, the same instinct that had guided me through business negotiations when something hidden required attention. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded several stapled pages bearing notarization stamps and formal signatures. As I read the first paragraph, the context unfolded with increasing clarity. The document outlined a financial agreement executed after a speculative investment scandal involving my parents, detailing how a series of failed ventures had left them exposed to substantial debt, including personal guarantees that threatened bankruptcy and potential legal consequences. The figures were precise, and one number stood out immediately. For $0.6 million, the amount my grandfather had transferred to stabilize their losses and shield them from collapse. In exchange for that bailout, The agreement stipulated that Linda and Thomas formally waived any future inheritance rights to his estate, acknowledging that the transfer constituted an advance settlement of any claim they might otherwise assert. Their signatures were present at the bottom of each page, alongside a notary seal verifying the execution of the contract. I sat back in a leather chair behind the desk, absorbing the implications. This was not an informal understanding or a private family conversation. It was a legally binding document drafted with the same rigor my grandfather applied to his commercial dealings. The timing aligned with a period I vaguely remembered from childhood, when tension in our house felt sharper and financial discussions were abruptly cut short whenever I entered the room. I had been too young to understand the specifics then, but now the pieces assembled into a coherent narrative. They had already received millions decades earlier, not as inheritance, but as rescue, and in doing so had relinquished any future claim. Tucked behind the agreement was a smaller notebook page torn from one of his journals. The paper creased as if it had been folded and unfolded several times. In his unmistakable handwriting, firm and slightly slanted, he had written a brief reflection. They had their chance. Ethan builds. The others consume. The sentence was stark, stripped of sentimentality, and reading it felt less like a revelation and more like confirmation of a pattern I had sensed my entire life but never seen articulated so plainly. There was no bitterness in the words, only assessment, the kind he used when evaluating properties or partnerships. At the bottom of the envelope rested a small USB drive, secured with a paperclip. I hesitated only briefly before inserting it into my laptop. The video file that opened was time-stamped 6 months before his death. The camera angles suggested it had been recorded intentionally, positioned on the edge of his desk with the city skyline visible behind him. He looked older than I remembered in casual moments, thinner perhaps, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He began by stating the date and affirming clearly that he was of sound mind and fully aware of his decisions regarding the distribution of his estate. His voice carried the same measured cadence he used during property walkthroughs, steady and deliberate. He spoke directly about the choice to leave the entirety of his holdings to me, explaining that stewardship required discipline and that legacy demanded more than entitlement. He referenced the 1991 agreement without elaborating on details, noting that prior arrangements had already addressed obligations to others and that his final will reflected long considered judgment rather than impulse. There was no hesitation in his speech, no visible confusion, no sign of diminished capacity. Watching him, I felt a mixture of sorrow and resolve, because this recording dismantled the central pillar of my parents' lawsuit with a clarity that legal arguments alone could not achieve. I delivered the envelope, the journal page, and the USB drive to Gregory Hastings the following morning. He reviewed the documents with an intensity that replaced his usual neutrality with something closer to restrained astonishment. After verifying the notarization, cross-checking archival records, and confirming the authenticity of the video file's metadata, he leaned back in a chair and stated in calm, but unmistakably firm language that the materials were legitimate and devastating to the opposing claims. The 1991 waiver alone significantly undermined my parents' standing, and the video recording of my grandfather affirming his mental soundness directly contradicted allegations of diminished capacity. As I left Gregory's office that day, carrying only copies while the originals remained secured for court submission, I felt the balance of the conflict shift in a way that was not loud or triumphant but decisive. The smear campaign, the asset freeze, the public insinuations had all been constructed on a narrative of manipulation and vulnerability. Yet inside that sealed envelope lay proof that the truth had been documented decades earlier and reaffirmed months before his death. The study where I found it no longer felt like a quiet relic of the past, but like a vault that had preserved not just papers, but intention. By the time the court date approached, I understood that presenting evidence within a courtroom would not be enough, because the battle had already been waged in public perception for months, and silence had allowed my parents' narrative to root itself in headlines and whispered conversations. So I shifted from reactive defense to deliberate counter-strategy. deciding that if the truth was going to surface, it would do so on my terms and with precision rather than emotional outbursts. The first unexpected piece of leverage came through Ryan Mercer, Brittany's ex-boyfriend, someone I had met only a handful of times during family gatherings when he hovered at the edge of conversations, looking perpetually uncomfortable. And after their messy breakup, he reached out to me quietly through an encrypted email, stating that there were things I needed to hear before the court proceedings began. We met in a neutral office space downtown, not out of secrecy, but caution, and Ryan arrived carrying an external drive and an expression that suggested both reluctance and relief. He explained that during their relationship, Brittany often vented openly about family matters, assuming privacy within the confines of casual voicemails and late-night recordings she sent him. And when he discovered the extent of the legal accusations against me, he felt compelled to preserve what he had rather than delete it out of spite. As he played the first voicemail, I listened to my sister's voice laced with impatience and thinly veiled contempt, mocking my grandfather's age and referring to him as outdated and stubborn, dismissing his business acumen as something that belonged to another era. In another recording, her tone shifted from irritation to calculation as she discussed how things would be fixed after he was gone, implying that wills could be challenged and narratives reshaped if presented strategically enough. The recordings were not explosive in the theatrical sense. There were no explicit confessions of wrongdoing, but the subtext was unmistakable, revealing an awareness of estate maneuvering long before my grandfather's passing and contradicting the image of a blindsided daughter devastated by an unexpected inheritance decision. Hearing her speak so casually about correcting outcomes once he was no longer present clarified the intention behind the lawsuit in a way no speculation ever could. I ensured that Gregory reviewed the audio files, and after verifying their authenticity and chain of custody, he confirmed that while not all content would be admissible directly, the existence of such material strengthened the broader narrative of premeditated contestation rather than genuine concern. Simultaneously, I brought in Danielle Brooks, a crisis public relations strategist known for navigating high-profile corporate disputes without descending into tabloid theatrics. Danielle approached the situation analytically, mapping out timelines of media coverage, identifying key misinformation threads, and advising against impulsive rebuttals. She emphasized that credibility is rebuilt not through volume, but through coherence. And together we structured a controlled 3-part online documentary designed to release one day before the court hearing, not as a smear, but as a contextual correction. The production was restrained, visually clean, and devoid of sensational music or dramatic narration, relying instead on documented evidence and first-hand accounts. The first segment centered on my grandfather's recorded testimony from the USB drive I had discovered in his study, presenting excerpts of him affirming his mental clarity and intentional decision-making, his voice steady, his language precise, time-stamped, and authenticated. The second segment featured tenant testimonials from properties I had personally overseen during renovation projects over the years, individuals who spoke about my involvement not as a distant heir, but as someone who walked job sites, negotiated fair lease restructurings, and invested in community upgrades. Their words grounded the abstract concept of stewardship in tangible actions. The third segment addressed the falsified financial screenshots that had derailed my Denver deal, displaying side-by-side comparisons of authentic account statements and the manipulated versions circulated by anonymous sources, with forensic experts outlining inconsistencies in metadata and formatting. When the documentary series went live across control platforms, the impact was immediate but not chaotic. Rather than explosive outrage, there was a noticeable recalibration in tone across social media threads and local business forums. Journalists who had previously framed the conflict as a sensational millionaire family feud began referencing documented evidence, and commentators who once echoed allegations of undue influence shifted toward questioning the motives behind the lawsuit itself. The narrative did not flip overnight into universal support, but it evolved from assumption to scrutiny, and that shift mattered more than applause. In the hours leading up to the court appearance, I observed the digital discourse not with satisfaction, but with strategic awareness. Public opinion is volatile, But transparency anchored in verifiable proof carries weight that rumor cannot easily erode. The release timing ensured that when we stepped into the courtroom the following morning, the conversation outside those walls was no longer dominated solely by insinuations of manipulation, but balanced by clear documentation of intent, capacity, and prior agreements. The counterattack was not loud. It was measured, structured to mirror the discipline my grandfather had modeled in every negotiation, and as I prepared for the legal confrontation ahead, I felt the momentum shift, not because of aggression, but because the truth had finally been positioned where it could no longer be ignored. The hearing at Multnomah County Superior Court began on a cold morning that felt almost deliberately neutral, as if the weather itself refused to favor either side. And when I walked through the courthouse doors flanked by my legal team, I carried no visible emotion, only a steady awareness that months of calculated attacks were about to be measured against documented fact. The courtroom was larger than I expected, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches that creaked softly as observers settled in, a mixture of local reporters, business associates, and distant relatives drawn by the spectacle that had been building for nearly a year. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table beside their counsel, their posture composed, their expressions calibrated somewhere between injury and dignity, while Brittany kept her gaze forward with a rigidity that suggested rehearsed resolve. Their attorney opened with an emotional narrative carefully constructed to appeal to perception rather than proof, describing an aging patriarch allegedly isolated from his immediate family, influenced by an ambitious grandson who positioned himself as indispensable during vulnerable months. The language was dramatic but conspicuously light on substantiated documentation, leaning heavily on insinuation and character framing. My mother dabbed at her eyes at strategic intervals. My father maintained a solemn stillness, and Brittany avoided eye contact with anyone in the gallery. Listening to the argument, I recognized the same structure that had fueled the smear campaign, compelling in tone yet hollow in evidentiary weight. When it was our turn, Gregory Hastings rose with the same controlled demeanor he had maintained from the beginning of this ordeal, and rather than countering theatrics with theatrics, he introduced documents methodically, beginning with certified medical record from the final year of my grandfather's life. These records, signed by his primary physician and corroborated by cognitive assessments, stated clearly that Walter exhibited full mental clarity, no signs of dementia, and no diminished decision-making capacity. The judge reviewed the documentation in silence, occasionally adjusting his glasses as pages turned, and the shift in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Next came the notarized disinheritance agreement from 1991, the document bearing my parents' signatures acknowledging the $4.6 million bailout and their formal waiver of future inheritance rights. The notary seal, the financial transfer records, and the archival confirmation of the agreements filing left little room for reinterpretation. My father's composure tightened at that moment, his jaw setting harder than before, while my mother's earlier display of fragility gave way to a rigid stillness. Gregory then introduced excerpts from the voicemail recordings provided by Ryan Mercer, not to sensationalize, but to demonstrate pre-existing intent to challenge and manipulate the estate structure. The audio played briefly in court with Brittany's own voice referencing plans to fix the will after he was gone. The courtroom absorbed the words in a heavy quiet that felt far more impactful than raised voices ever could. Finally, the recorded video testimony from my grandfather was presented, the timestamp visible, his declaration of sound mind and deliberate intention unmistakable. Seeing him on the courtroom monitor, composed and lucid, felt like watching him step forward one last time to defend his own decisions. The judge observed the footage without interruption, and when it concluded, there was no dramatic exchange, only a long pause that carried the weight of clarity. After brief deliberation, the judge dismissed the case in its entirety, citing lack of evidentiary support and the strength of documented counterproof, and went further by referring aspects of the plaintiff's claims and submitted materials for civil fraud review due to discrepancies and potential fabrication. The outcome reverberated beyond the courtroom almost immediately. By the following morning, Headlines that once framed the situation as a family feud shifted toward coverage of dismissed claims and possible fraud implications. Media outlets that had speculated about manipulation now referenced falsified evidence and prior financial agreements. Brittany's influencer partnerships began dissolving within weeks as sponsors distanced themselves from controversy tied to documented misrepresentation, her carefully curated online presence fracturing under scrutiny. My father's consulting firm came under investigation for unrelated financial irregularities that surfaced as reporters examined his business dealings more closely, and long-standing clients withdrew quietly, unwilling to risk association. My mother, whose social standing within certain community circles had once been meticulously maintained through charity luncheons and curated appearances, found invitations thinning and conversations shortening, reputational currency evaporating in spaces where perception had always mattered most. Months later, long after the legal dust had settled and the scholarship fund had awarded its first round of grants, I returned home one evening to find an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was the original $750 check, torn cleanly in half, no note attached, no explanation offered. I held the pieces in my hands for several minutes, studying the blue ink that had once been presented as my supposed share of a lifetime's work. There was no anger left in me, only a quiet recognition of what that gesture had represented from the beginning. They had tried to reduce legacy to a token, to compress decades of mentorship and trust into pocket change meant to humiliate. The following weekend, I visited the small park where a tree had been planted in my grandfather's honor, a modest plaque at its base bearing his name and the years of his life. The soil around it was still fresh enough to dig with minimal effort. I knelt, placed the torn halves of the check into the earth beneath the roots, and covered them carefully, pressing the soil down with steady hands. It felt less like disposal and more like closure, as though the insult had been returned to the ground where it could no longer circulate. Standing there, I reflected on the arc of everything that had unfolded. They attempted to erase me with a gesture designed to belittle and provoke, to corner me into either submission or reckless reaction. I responded not with spectacle, but with documentation, not with shouting, but with patience, not with retaliation, but with the preservation of what had been entrusted to me. In the end, the contrast was simple and stark. They offered pocket change as erasure. I answered with evidence, discipline, and a legacy that continued to grow beyond their reach.